Greetings, we are in Junior English and we are continuing with our conversations regarding Emily Dickinson, and today now we're going to work with a really famous poem of Dickinson's on page 411 of your hymnals called I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died. This I think I've already referenced in an earlier lecture. Dickinson played the game of dying. I'm going to call it a game. She clearly thought a lot about those final moments when finally your heart, 4, 3, 2, 1, flatline, and you're dead, you're done, it's all over. She definitely gave time and thought to that moment in her life. She saw it clearly. She saw it as an inevitable moment. It's not like anybody gets out of that project. And since it's inevitable and it's coming, why not give a little thought and preparation to it? What will it be like? Now there's two interpretations of this poem, both a negative one and a positive one. That is to say, there's one view of this poem that's almost like humorous. In other words, Dickinson kind of sees it as funny, what happens in the final moment of her death. And then there's another view of this that's a little darker interpretation. And what I will do is I will lend the opportunity to you to decide how you read this poem. Now, the reading of these Emily Dickinson poems is kind of a compounding project. After you've read a few of them, you kind of start to get accustomed to the lay of the land, if you will, and then you can kind of start to get more of a sense of what's being said right away. Let's say if, for example, you can figure out what it is that she's saying about the moment of her death in this poem. I'm reading with you now on page 411, all right? I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. The eyes around had wrung them dry, and breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion to me be assignable, and then it was there interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz between the light and me, and then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see. Now, let's talk about this set of lines for just a second. What exactly is it that she says in this poem? Well, first of all, let's just put it in your notes this way. This is a poem about a dead person writing. A dead person speaking. Yes? Okay? She says, I heard a fly buzz when I died. Alright? So in other words, already you're not going to be working at the literal level here. Dead people don't write poems about dying. Yes? Okay? So this is already a work of the imagination, huh? In other words, she's imagining what it's like when she dies. Notice the first thing she points out, line 2, how still the room is. What room do you imagine? Well, probably the very room she lived in all her life, her bedroom. That was how you died, because you didn't die in hospitals in Emily's day. In today's day, of course, most of the time people die in hospitals, those buildings that we drive by and pray we never have to go inside. And when we do go inside, it's kind of a foreign or a strange place. It does beg a really interesting 3B question. If you had to die in your final moments, where would you prefer to do it? In a room you've never seen before in your life, a hospital room, or in the room where you've hung out all your life, if wherever you live? It's an interesting question, right? Some students have reported, I guess if I think about it, I probably would rather die where I'm kind of surrounded by the people I know and my house and stuff, my home. Notice the room is still. Notice she says the stillness in the room was like. Oh, what's a comparison using like or as? You'll jot it down in 2B. What do we call that? A comparison using like or as is what we call it looks like the word smile, doesn't it? But it's not the word smile, it's the word simile, S-I-M-I-L-E, right? A simile is a comparison using like or as. What was the stillness in the room like? The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air, dash, before the heaves of storm. Interesting. In other words, if you've ever been around a storm, when you know it's about to hit, but then there's this bizarre stillness right before, right? You know the wind, for example, is about to come. You know maybe rain, lightning, thunder is about to happen, but all of a sudden there's this weird calm. When you were a little kid, you're like, cool, let's go out and play. And all the adults went, no, right? Okay. If you live, for example, in Oklahoma, in Tornado Alley. They teach their children early on. There's a moment right before the big tornado happens, and the sun comes out, and it's beautiful, and it's still, and it's so nice, and you want to go out there. Yeah, no, not so much, right? It's like those who live in tsunami areas where tidal waves happen, where the water will all of a sudden go way back from the shoreline out into the ocean, and children, if they're not taught right, will go, oh, cool, let's go like pick up stuff. No. Because all of a sudden there's going to be a 30-foot wall of water coming, which is why the water went away. There's that still moment. She says, right before I died, it was really still in the room like that. Look at the next stanza. Uh-oh, she's not alone. She's not alone. She doesn't die alone. She doesn't imagine dying alone, which asks a really interesting question in 3b. If you had to die, would you rather die alone? Or would you rather die with other people there? And some students will say, well, that's a really weird question. Emily Dickinson has made me think about that now a different way, I guess. Because on the one hand, dying alone, I suppose, is kind of like, well, I guess I've lived kind of, my life. I might as well just die, alone. Others will say, I would really like to be surrounded by some people. Of course, the reality is, if those people care for you and you're dying, they're going to be sad, right? Take a look. The eyes around had wrung them dry. What does that mean, had wrung them dry? Well, they've cried until they can't cry anymore. In other words, their eyes are now dry. They've cried until they're dry now. They're just like, now's the time. It's time to leave. And breaths were gathering firm for that last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. Now that's an interesting set of lines. In other words, the breath, the breathing of the people are like, okay, this is it. The last seconds when the person stops breathing. And the king, capital K, the king be witnessed, witness means seen, in the room. King? What king? Well, now this is an interesting question. And again, Dickinson didn't leave behind letters and journals and notes to tell us what she was talking about when she said king. There's been a couple of readings of this poem. I'll ask you to write them both down in your notes. One is the king here means God. God. That is to say, after Emily dies, she knows she's going to heaven where she will meet God. And she pictures maybe God is by kind of inviting her to heaven. It's okay, you lived, now it's time to go bye-bye. You have to leave the park and go to the van. You can't stay forever at the park. Come on, it's time to go bye-bye. The king God here, okay? And if you have a Christian view of the afterlife for Emily Dickinson, maybe she kind of sees God that way, right? The king. There is a second reading. And it's a little bit darker reading, and the king here is actually the Grim Reaper, death. In other words, she kind of looks past the shoulders of the people and the heads of the people who are our closest people there, and all of a sudden she sees death, maybe all dressed in black. The king of the underworld for the Greeks was named Hades, and Hades comes and says, now, let's go, right? Okay, that's death. And so there's two views. Some of you will say, I kind of know which one of these two views is more attractive, right? As I think about it. Do you want to see a certain kind of figure that says, it's okay, it's all right, let's go. Or a figure that says, you, now, let's go, right? Look at the third stanza. Uh-oh, before she died, she willed her keepsakes. What does that mean? See, that's a very interesting thing. Sometimes students have said, I guess I really haven't thought about that. But when somebody dies, especially if they have time and they kind of know that they're dying, well, they have to decide what they're going to do with all their stuff. Their keepsakes. Like the stuff that they have that's theirs. A lot of that stuff might be worth money. Some of that might not be worth much money, but it might be really important to you. Who gets that stuff? Who gets it? So she's taken care of distributing all of her stuff. Interestingly, Emily Dickinson herself willed what about this very poem that she wrote? What did she want this poem to happen to this poem? Destroy it. Burn it. We would have never been able to read this poem if those people had followed her orders, right? We're kind of happy that they didn't. I willed my keepsakes, signed away what portion of me be assignable. In other words, what I could give away, I gave away. I mean, there's no point unless you're an Egyptian. Do you know about the Egyptians? What did they do? Yeah, the pharaohs, right, would make sure they got buried with all their stuff. It's kind of funny to think of these terms, right? Buried with all their stuff. Why come? Well, they imagine death as a journey where on the other side you just woke up, just like you do when you take a nap and you wake up. And then on the other side you needed to have all your stuff with you. Of course, there's one or two treasure seekers, right, who in the 19th century said, sweet. And then they went and found all of these tombs, right? And they're like, whoa, there's lots of stuff buried with these guys. And some of that stuff was worth some serious bank, right? Notice she says, I willed away, and I signed away, and I'm ready to go. Stillness in the room. When all of a sudden, there interposed, you can guess what that word means, a fly. Notice the word fly is capitalized. Just like the word king was capitalized. You got this huge housefly that enters the room. Notice she describes the fly with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz. Of course, that word buzz is our word. We like that word in literary analysis. Onomatopoeia, which of course for children is always funny. You've heard what? No. Onomatopoeia just simply means a word that has its sound contained in the word. Buzz is a word that when you say the word, it has the same meaning and sound that the word will mean, right? Notice this fly, she says, comes in with a adjectives matter for Emily Dickinson. What kind of buzz? A stumbling buzz. In other words, it's almost like the fly is trying to get out, maybe, trying to escape out of the room. Between the light and me. And then the windows failed. And then I could not see to see. How's the poem end? Right? She dies. She can't see anymore. The way she kind of thinks about dying is what you can see out of your eyes. And once your eyes can't see anything, they shut. It's done. It's over. Now let's talk about two interpretations of this poem at 2A. Well, one interpretation of this poem is that Emily Dickinson almost sees it as kind of funny. Humorous, if you will. That there in this very serious, somber moment, when everybody's cried their eyes out, all of a sudden in this most serious moment, in comes a fly. And it's the last thing she notices as she goes. Notice it isn't the people sitting there. It's this fly trying to get out of the room, right? It's almost funny. I've had students that say, what a funny poem. I mean, it's like so serious and everybody's like so somber. And all of a sudden, if she could say it out loud, she'd be like, that's funny. Look, there's a fly trying to get out of the room. Funny. Interesting. A poet sees things differently. And so you get a sense that she imagines, when I die, I bet I see things differently than most people. Whereas most people would be like, oh no, it's time to die, it's time to die. Instead for me, I'm going to be like, whoa, dude, there's a fly up there against the window. That's kind of weird. In some ways, it's almost metaphoric, isn't it? The fly trying to escape is like the energy or her solar spirit trying to escape. See, there's a way to see this in almost a humorous and positive way. There is a second way, though. And scholars have done this, where they put the word king, capital K, together with the word fly. Often when you're a senior at Worland High School, you will read a novel called Lord of the Flies, which is a famous novel that's a disturbing novel. Flies, of course, is referencing what Milton, the great British poet, would reference as evil. Flies, of course, we know, feed on dead things, carrion, don't they, right? So, for example, if you're walking in the woods, you see a dead animal, often you will see a fly, won't you? That's a way to kind of think about death in a bad way, not a good way, right? And so there's a second reading of this poem that says, in this poem, Dickinson is really talking about how terrible it is to die. That the only thing that remains when you're gone is for the flies to come. Right? The bad, the flies, the yucky. So there's kind of two views of this. Notice Dickinson doesn't tell you which one of these two views is her view. Right? She just kind of leaves it up to you, the reader, to decide. So let's do a quick finishing of our annotation. At 2B, we mentioned already the similes here. Right, the simile that's mentioned, that's an easy one that you can write down at 2B. Notice that simile of the stillness in the room was like the stillness right before the storm. Remember at 2B, rhetoric. R-H-E-T-O-R-I-C, rhetoric. Not what the poet says, but how the poet says it. Notice as well all the dashes. But if you'll think about it, that makes sense, because what is it that the breath and the eyes and sight do when you're dying? It starts getting shorter and shorter, right? And more broken. The dashes will break up the lines in the same way that breathing becomes shorter, or the eyes start blinking, and then all of a sudden, one time in your life, your eyes will blink shut, and that'll be all. She says, that'll be all. They'll be over, right? So the blinking are kind of like the dashes. How about 3A? What is your favorite movie? It sounds strange to say it this way, but what is your favorite movie about dying? What is your favorite movie about somebody dying? And it's funny because a lot of times my students will say, I don't even have movies about dying. Really, list your 5 greatest movies and ask yourself the simple question if somebody dies in them. Go ahead, I dare you. I challenge you to do this. And some of you will say, well, I guess I never really thought about that, but the movies that I watch, not a lot of dying in them. Well, that's interesting. Why is that? Why is it that maybe we don't like texts that have to do with dying? Because I don't want to think about dying. Oh, because it's not going to happen to you. You're never going to die. Oh, it's not going to happen to the people who you love. They're never going to go. I don't want to think about it. Why not? See, Emily Dickinson will ask, why not? Because it kind of freaks me out. Freaks you out? Why? Because of all the things in your life, that's the one absolute certainty, is that you know that thing's going to happen. I just don't want to think about that. Emily Dickinson says, yeah, I get you. But if you start at least thinking about it, at least you can grow a little bit more accustomed to the idea. Maybe it's not so scary. And if it's not so scary, then you can start living your life without fear. Because one of the greatest fears in human existence is the fear of death. Right? Is there, for you, a movie or a text that says something about being brave or being courageous, where the fundamental truth of the film is, don't be afraid. It's going to be all right. It's going to be okay. Do you have a movie like that? Or, maybe better, do you have a favorite song like that? A song that actually says to you, don't worry, it's okay. Everything's all right. You'll figure it out. It's all going to be okay. You can kind of write that down. Okay? All right, finally, 3B. How do you interpret this poem? See, it's a 3B. It's a personal interpretation. A couple of questions. What do you think about death and dying? Do you think it's a good idea to think about death and dying, or is it something that you should just completely ignore until the moment that it happens? Some students will say, yeah, you shouldn't think about it. Think about living, don't think about dying. Okay? Other students will say, you know, it's kind of like the penny that I picked up once. There's always 2 sides to it, funny thing. So if I were to pick up the penny and say, I only want to see one side of this coin, you would say, yeah, no, that's not the way it works. For it to be a coin, there's got to be the other side. For there to be life, there must be. See how that works? Okay. How do you come down on this one? And finally, how do you interpret this poem? Do you see this poem as sad? Do you see this poem as funny? Do you see this poem as positive? Do you see this poem as negative? How do you read this poem? The fact that the fly shows up right at the end of her life. It's kind of an interesting question. If you were going to die and something non-human had to show up, some kind of animal, what would you like to have show up? Because for her it was a fly, which is not a very romantic kind of image or bug or whatever. Is there something you'd like to have show up? Maybe it would be some kind of large animal. Maybe it would be a tiger. Maybe some kind of big bird or something like that, right? Okay, you can kind of decide and write it down. All right, guys, there you go. I heard a fly buzz when I did.